The chilling tale of Joseph Corcoran is one of betrayal, cold-blooded vengeance, and a haunting descent into madness that ended in one of the most shocking quadruple homicides in Indiana's history. This harrowing case gripped the nation as Corcoran, a man already haunted by a troubled past, took the lives of 4 people in a single night, including members of his own family. As investigators unraveled the brutal crime, they uncovered a web of paranoia, unrelenting anger, and unresolved trauma. This story not only culminates in Corcoran's conviction and the imposition of the death penalty, but also forces us to confront deeper questions about the intersection of mental illness, familial dysfunction, and unrepentant violence. Joseph Corcoran's life began in the shadow of dysfunction and despair, a haunting prelude to the devastating acts he would commit later in life. From the very beginning, his environment was one of turbulence, with the instability of his family serving as a catalyst for the darkness that would envelop him. Born in the late 1970s in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Joseph was thrust into a household marred by conflict, neglect, and emotional strain. His parents, struggling with their own personal demons, were ill-equipped to provide the nurturing foundation necessary for a child to thrive. As a boy, Joseph displayed signs of a sensitive nature, yearning for connection and stability. However, his early attempts to seek solace in his family often ended in disappointment. His father, an authoritarian figure, was known for his explosive temper and disciplinary methods that bordered on abuse. Meanwhile, his mother, overwhelmed by her circumstances, oscillated between moments of affection and long periods of emotional detachment. This inconsistency left young Joseph feeling unloved and unworthy, planting the seeds of resentment and isolation that would later dominate his psyche. School, which might have been a sanctuary for a child in such turmoil, offered little relief. Joseph was often the target of ridicule from his peers, who sensed his vulnerability and exploited it. He struggled academically, not for lack of intelligence, but because the chaos at home made it nearly impossible for him to concentrate. Teachers noticed his withdrawn demeanor and his occasional outbursts of anger, but their interventions were superficial at best, addressing the symptoms without delving into the root causes of his behavior. By the time Joseph reached his teenage years, the cracks in his emotional and psychological state were beginning to widen. It was during adolescence that Joseph began to exhibit more pronounced signs of paranoia and distrust. His interactions with others became increasingly strained, as he convinced himself that even benign comments or actions were veiled attempts to harm or mock him. This pervasive sense of betrayal extended to his family, with Joseph frequently accusing them of favoritism or plotting against him. His siblings, struggling to navigate their own relationships with their parents, often bore the brunt of his anger. Arguments within the household became more frequent and more volatile, with Joseph's explosive temper often serving as the catalyst. Despite his growing issues, there were fleeting moments when Joseph seemed capable of normalcy. He held part-time jobs, engaged in small social circles, and even displayed a sense of humor on occasion. These glimpses of the person he could have been made his eventual descent into violence all the more tragic. Those who knew him during this period described him as a walking contradiction, someone who was both eager for connection and quick to push others away. By the time Joseph entered his 20s, his paranoia had become a defining feature of his personality. He often spoke in cryptic terms about people turning against him or plotting behind his back. These delusions were compounded by his inability to form meaningful, trusting relationships. Romantic connections were fleeting, as Joseph's insecurities and mistrust led to constant conflicts. Friends distanced themselves, unable to cope with his erratic behavior. Even family members who had once tried to support him began to withdraw, feeling helpless in the face of his escalating anger. What made Joseph's transformation even more alarming was his apparent refusal to seek help. Whether out of pride, fear, or a genuine belief that he was not the problem, he rejected offers of therapy or counseling. Instead, he retreated further into his own mind, creating an echo chamber for his darkest thoughts. His paranoia became self-sustaining, as every slight, real or perceived, reinforced his belief that the world was against him. This isolation created the perfect breeding ground for the violence that would later erupt. Those closest to Joseph described him as someone who was perpetually on edge, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. His demeanor shifted from moments of eerie calm to sudden outbursts of rage, often over trivial matters. He began to collect grievances, both imagined and real, against those around him. His mind became a ledger of wrongs, each entry fueling his growing sense of injustice. This obsessive focus on perceived slights would later play a pivotal role in his decision to commit the horrific acts that would shock the nation. Joseph's environment also contributed to his unraveling. Fort Wayne, like many small cities, was a place where rumors spread quickly and privacy was hard to come by. For someone as paranoid as Joseph, this was a nightmare scenario. He became convinced that neighbors were gossiping about him, that co-workers were undermining him, and that even his own family was discussing his flaws behind his back. These delusions were not grounded in reality, but in Joseph's mind, they were undeniable truths. His distrust extended even to those who had shown him kindness, as he interpreted their actions as manipulative or insincere. Compounding his paranoia was Joseph's fixation on control. He had a deep-seated need to assert dominance over his surroundings, a need that was often thwarted by the chaos of his environment. This lack of control became a source of profound frustration for him, fueling his anger and deepening his resentment. His inability to manage his emotions only exacerbated the situation, as his outbursts alienated the very people who might have helped him. Despite these warning signs, there was little intervention from those around him. Whether out of fear, ignorance, or a belief that Joseph was simply difficult, his behavior was largely ignored or dismissed. This lack of accountability allowed his anger to fester, transforming it from a simmering undercurrent into a raging inferno. By the time Joseph committed the quadruple homicide, he was a man consumed by his own demons, unable or unwilling to distinguish reality from his delusions. Looking back, it's clear that Joseph Corcoran's journey toward becoming a mass murderer was not a sudden descent, but a gradual erosion of his humanity. His troubled upbringing, coupled with his untreated mental illness and unrelenting paranoia, created a perfect storm of factors that culminated in tragedy. The early years of his life, though marked by hardship, were not without potential. But as the darkness within him grew, it overshadowed any chance of redemption, leaving behind a legacy of pain, loss, and unanswered questions. The night of July 26, 1997, began in unremarkable fashion, yet it would end in a bloodbath that would shock the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and leave an indelible stain on the lives of those who knew Joseph Corcoran and his victims. The events that transpired in the Corcoran household that evening were not the result of a sudden loss of control, but rather the culmination of years of seething resentment, paranoia, and untreated mental illness. Joseph Corcoran's inner turmoil, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over in a horrifying act of violence. That summer night, the Corcoran home was bustling with activity. Joseph, who had been living with his brother James and James's wife Kelly, was in the company of family and friends. The gathering seemed innocuous, even pleasant, a group of close-knit individuals sharing stories and laughter, temporarily setting aside the strains of everyday life. But beneath the surface, tensions had been brewing for weeks. Joseph's erratic behavior had caused friction within the household, and his increasing paranoia was a source of constant strain on his relationships with his family. The people present that evening included James Corcoran, Joseph's older brother, who had often served as a stabilizing force in Joseph's life. James, a hard-working and affable man, had opened his home to Joseph despite the challenges that came with his brother's volatile temperament. Kelly Corcoran, James's wife, had also been patient with Joseph, though she had privately expressed concerns about his escalating paranoia. The others present included Thomas Corbett, an uncle who had maintained a close relationship with the family, and Tim Green, a family friend who was a regular visitor to the household. Unbeknownst to the others, Joseph had spent much of the evening stewing in his own thoughts, his mind racing with accusations and imagined betrayals. Over the preceding weeks, his paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He had convinced himself that his brother James and others in the family were conspiring against him, though there was no evidence to support these claims. Joseph's belief in this imagined betrayal consumed him, and he began to view his family not as allies but as enemies plotting his downfall. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the house remained cordial, even jovial. The group was relaxed, enjoying the simple pleasures of each other's company. Joseph, however, was a silent observer, his demeanor unusually tense. He had spoken little throughout the evening, responding to questions with terse monosyllabic answers. Those present chalked it up to Joseph's reclusive nature, unaware of the storm brewing within him. At some point during the gathering, Joseph quietly left the room and made his way to a closet where a .22 caliber rifle was stored. The weapon, which had been kept in the house for recreational purposes, was easily accessible. As Joseph retrieved the rifle, his thoughts raced. He felt a sense of grim determination, convinced that his family's alleged betrayal left him no choice but to act. In his mind, he was not preparing to commit an atrocity, but rather to defend himself against enemies who sought to harm him. Returning to the room with the rifle in hand, Joseph's presence immediately changed the atmosphere. The laughter and conversation stopped abruptly as the others registered what was happening. Confusion turned to fear as Joseph raised the weapon, his expression cold and detached. James, sitting closest to Joseph, was the first to speak, pleading with his brother to put the gun down. But Joseph, lost in his delusions, offered no response. Instead, he fired the first shot, hitting James in the chest. Panic erupted as the others scrambled to make sense of the situation. Kelly screamed and attempted to shield herself behind a chair, but Joseph's fury was unrelenting. He turned the rifle on her next, firing multiple shots in quick succession. Thomas Corbett, shocked and horrified, tried to reason with Joseph, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. But Joseph's paranoia had completely overtaken him, and he viewed his uncle's approach as a threat. A single shot ended Thomas's life. Tim Green, the last remaining target, attempted to flee the house, but Joseph pursued him with the relentlessness of a man possessed. Tim's escape was thwarted when he stumbled near the front door. Joseph, showing no hesitation, fired the final shots that ended his friend's life. In a matter of minutes, 4 lives were extinguished, leaving the Corcoran household a scene of unimaginable carnage. Neighbors, alarmed by the sound of gunfire, had already called 911. Police arrived at the scene within minutes, finding Joseph standing amidst the bodies of his victims. His demeanor was eerily calm, as though he had completed a necessary task. He offered no resistance as officers placed him in handcuffs, nor did he express any emotion when asked why he had committed the murders. Instead, he reportedly muttered something about betrayal, his words offering a chilling glimpse into the delusional world that had driven him to such an atrocity. The crime scene itself was a harrowing sight. Blood pooled on the floor, and the expressions of terror and confusion on the faces of the deceased spoke volumes about the horror they had experienced in their final moments. Investigators methodically documented the evidence, including the rifle Joseph had used to carry out the killings. The sheer brutality of the crime left even seasoned detectives shaken. As news of the quadruple homicide spread, the community of Fort Wayne was thrown into a state of shock and mourning. The Corcoran family, once regarded as a typical working-class household, became the focus of intense media scrutiny. Neighbors and acquaintances expressed disbelief, struggling to reconcile the Joseph Corcoran they had known, a quiet, if somewhat odd, individual, with the cold-blooded killer responsible for such a heinous act. In the days that followed, additional details about the crime began to emerge, painting a clearer picture of the events leading up to that fateful night. Joseph's descent into paranoia had not gone unnoticed by those close to him, but the extent of his delusions had been underestimated. Family members revealed that Joseph had frequently accused them of conspiring against him, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic in the months leading up to the murders. Yet, despite these warning signs, no one had anticipated that his paranoia would escalate into violence. The quadruple homicide marked a tragic end to years of unresolved tensions within the Corcoran family. While the victims were mourned and celebrated for their lives and contributions, the shadow of Joseph's actions loomed large. The events of that night would become a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of untreated mental illness, paranoia, and unchecked rage. In the days following the murders, the investigation into Joseph Corcoran's heinous actions unfolded with meticulous precision. The Fort Wayne Police Department, already reeling from the sheer brutality of the crime scene, quickly assembled a team of detectives and forensic experts to piece together the events that had led to the massacre. Their goal was not only to build an airtight case for prosecution, but also to understand the psychological and emotional triggers that had turned Joseph into a mass murderer. Joseph Corcoran's arrest had been uneventful. He offered no resistance when officers arrived at the blood-soaked home, surrendering himself in a state of eerie calm. This lack of struggle immediately struck the officers as unusual. Many perpetrators of violent crimes exhibit some form of panic or distress after the fact, but Joseph seemed almost indifferent. This demeanor, combined with his vague mutterings about betrayal, hinted at a deeply fractured psyche. At the station, investigators began the arduous process of questioning him. Initially, Joseph was silent, offering little insight into his motivations or state of mind. However, as the hours passed, he began to speak in fragmented sentences, providing glimpses into the paranoid delusions that had driven him to kill. He spoke of feeling watched and betrayed by his family, alleging that they had conspired to destroy his life. Though his accusations were baseless, his unwavering belief in them revealed the depth of his mental deterioration. Detectives soon turned their attention to Joseph's background, seeking to understand how a man could commit such an unthinkable act against his own family. They interviewed friends, neighbors, and relatives, uncovering a portrait of a troubled individual whose life had been marred by instability, isolation, and untreated mental illness. Many of those who knew Joseph described him as a loner who had grown increasingly distrustful of others over the years. They recounted incidents of erratic behavior, including accusations of betrayal leveled at people who had shown him nothing but kindness. Perhaps the most revealing interviews came from Joseph's surviving relatives and acquaintances who had witnessed his downward spiral firsthand. They described a man who had been consumed by paranoia, convinced that those closest to him were plotting his demise. Family members recounted instances in which Joseph had accused them of talking about him behind his back or sabotaging his opportunities. His accusations were often accompanied by explosive fits of anger, leaving his loved ones feeling both confused and afraid. As investigators delved deeper into Joseph's mental state, they uncovered a pattern of behavior that suggested severe paranoid schizophrenia. Forensic psychologists and psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him, conducting a series of interviews and assessments to determine his level of culpability. Their findings painted a chilling picture. Joseph exhibited classic signs of paranoid schizophrenia, including delusions of persecution, distorted thinking, and an inability to distinguish reality from his delusions. These symptoms had likely been present for years, worsening over time due to a lack of treatment. Despite this diagnosis, there was considerable debate among the experts about the extent to which Joseph's mental illness had influenced his actions. On one hand, his delusions clearly played a role in his perception of his family as enemies. On the other hand, his methodical approach to the murders, retrieving the rifle, targeting each victim individually, and ensuring no one survived, suggested a level of premeditation that was difficult to reconcile with a purely psychotic break. This ambiguity would later become a focal point of the legal proceedings, as the court grappled with the question of whether Joseph was fully responsible for his actions. The physical evidence gathered at the crime scene further reinforced the narrative of a calculated attack. Forensic analysis of the rifle confirmed that it had been fired multiple times in a deliberate manner, with no signs of hesitation. Ballistic evidence indicated that Joseph had reloaded the weapon during the attack, suggesting that he had remained focused and intent on his objective throughout the ordeal. This level of control stood in stark contrast to the chaotic nature of his delusions, raising questions about the interplay between his mental illness and his capacity for rational thought. As the investigation progressed, detectives also uncovered a disturbing history of minor conflicts and grievances that Joseph had harbored against his family members. These grievances, though trivial to an outside observer, had taken on monumental significance in Joseph's mind. For instance, he believed that his brother James had deliberately undermined him in social situations, making him appear foolish in front of others. He accused his sister-in-law Kelly of gossiping about him, and he resented his Uncle Thomas for what he perceived as favoritism toward other family members. These perceived slights, amplified by his paranoia, had festered for years, ultimately culminating in the tragic events of that night. The community of Fort Wayne watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. Local newspapers ran front-page stories detailing the progress of the case, while television news segments featured interviews with neighbors who shared their shock and disbelief. The public's interest was fueled not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the psychological complexities of the perpetrator. Many struggled to comprehend how a man could turn on his own family in such a violent and unrelenting manner. Amidst the media frenzy, the victims' families grappled with their own grief and confusion. Surviving relatives were left to pick up the pieces, mourning the loss of their loved ones while coming to terms with the fact that the killer had been one of their own. For them, the investigation provided little solace, as no explanation could ever justify the magnitude of their loss. The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that Joseph had once been a part of their lives, a son, a brother, an uncle, whose descent into madness had gone unchecked. The investigation also highlighted systemic failures in addressing mental health issues within the criminal justice system. Many of those who knew Joseph expressed regret that they had not done more to intervene, though they admitted that his behavior had often been difficult to understand or address. Mental health advocates used the case as an example of the urgent need for better resources and support systems for individuals suffering from severe mental illness. They argued that Joseph's actions, while inexcusable, were a tragic outcome of a society that often overlooks or stigmatizes mental health struggles. As the evidence mounted, the case against Joseph Corcoran became increasingly clear-cut. The combination of his confession, the physical evidence, and the testimony of witnesses left little doubt about his guilt. However, the question of his mental state and the degree to which it should mitigate his culpability remained a contentious issue. This debate would later play a central role in his trial, as both the prosecution and the defense sought to shape the narrative of what had driven Joseph to commit such a monstrous act. For the investigators, however, the focus was on ensuring that justice would be served for the victims, whose lives had been cut tragically short by a man consumed by his own inner demons. The trial of Joseph Corcoran was one of the most highly publicized and emotionally charged legal proceedings in Indiana's history. The sheer brutality of the quadruple homicide, combined with the fact that the victims were Corcoran's own family and a close friend, drew widespread attention. The court was faced with the daunting task of delivering justice for the victims, while addressing the complex questions surrounding Joseph's mental health and culpability. From the outset, the prosecution aimed to paint a picture of a calculated and deliberate killer. They argued that Joseph Corcoran's actions on the night of July 26, 1997, were not the result of a spontaneous psychotic break, but a premeditated act of revenge, fueled by years of simmering resentment. Lead prosecutor Michael McAlexander opened his case with a detailed recounting of the events of that horrific night, emphasizing the cold and methodical manner in which Corcoran had executed his victims. He pointed out that Corcoran had retrieved the rifle from its storage place, loaded it, and systematically shot each of the 4 victims, ensuring no one was left alive to contradict his narrative. The prosecution also presented compelling forensic evidence to support their claims. Ballistics experts testified about the number of shots fired and the precision with which the weapon had been used, suggesting a level of control and intent that was inconsistent with an unplanned outburst. Crime scene photos, displayed in court, illustrated the gruesome aftermath of Corcoran's rampage, serving as a stark reminder of the lives lost and the calculated nature of the attack. But it was the testimonies of surviving relatives and acquaintances that brought the prosecution's argument to life. These witnesses described a man who had grown increasingly paranoid and hostile over the years, accusing his family of betraying him and harboring irrational grudges. They recounted instances of verbal altercations in which Joseph had threatened violence, though no one had taken his threats seriously at the time. The prosecution used these accounts to argue that Joseph's escalating paranoia and anger were clear warning signs of his potential for violence, signs that had tragically gone unheeded. The defense, led by attorney Mark Gevers, faced an uphill battle. They did not deny that Joseph had committed the murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Instead, their strategy focused on arguing that Joseph's severe mental illness had rendered him incapable of fully understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. Gevers emphasized Joseph's long history of untreated paranoid schizophrenia, presenting medical records and expert testimony to support the claim that his delusions had driven him to perceive his family as threats to his safety. The defense's case rested heavily on the testimony of forensic psychiatrists who had evaluated Joseph in the months following his arrest. These experts described a man whose reality was shaped by paranoia and delusion, a man who genuinely believed that his family was conspiring to harm him. They argued that while Joseph's actions were undeniably horrific, they were not the product of malice or premeditation, but of a profoundly disordered mind. One of the most compelling moments in the trial came when a psychiatrist, Dr. Lisa Becker, testified about the depth of Joseph's paranoia. She explained that individuals with severe paranoid schizophrenia often interpret benign interactions as hostile, leading them to act out of fear rather than rational thought. In Joseph's case, his delusions had become so pervasive that he believed his family's very existence posed a threat to his survival. This belief, Dr. Becker argued, was the driving force behind the murders. The prosecution, however, was quick to counter these claims. They argued that Joseph's ability to plan and execute the killings with such precision indicated a level of awareness and control that contradicted the defense's portrayal of him as a man lost in the grip of psychosis. Prosecutor McAlexander pointed out that Joseph had chosen a specific time to retrieve the rifle, targeted each victim deliberately, and ensured there were no survivors, all actions that suggested intent rather than impulse. The emotional impact of the trial was felt most acutely by the families of the victims, who attended every session, their grief and anguish palpable. James Corcoran's mother, visibly shaken, gave a tearful testimony about the loss of her son and daughter-in-law, as well as the lasting impact of the tragedy on their extended family. Tim Green's parents, too, spoke of the devastating void left by their son's death. Their presence in the courtroom served as a constant reminder of the human cost of Joseph's actions, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that justice demanded the harshest possible punishment. Throughout the trial, Joseph remained largely stoic, his expression inscrutable as witnesses recounted the horrors of his crime. His silence was interpreted in different ways by those present. Some saw it as a sign of indifference, while others viewed it as evidence of his detachment from reality. When he did speak, it was often to make cryptic statements about betrayal and self-defense, offering little insight into his true thoughts or feelings. The turning point of the trial came during the sentencing phase, where the jury was tasked with deciding whether Joseph should receive the death penalty. The prosecution argued that the heinous nature of the crime warranted the ultimate punishment, emphasizing the premeditated and deliberate manner in which Joseph had taken 4 lives. They highlighted the lasting pain and suffering inflicted on the victims' families and the need to send a strong message about the consequences of such acts. The defense, however, pleaded for leniency, urging the jury to consider Joseph's mental illness as a mitigating factor. Gevers made an impassioned argument, stating that while Joseph's actions were inexcusable, Executing a man with severe schizophrenia would be a violation of the principles of justice and humanity. He called on the jury to show compassion, suggesting that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be a more appropriate sentence. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching a unanimous decision. Joseph Corcoran would be sentenced to death. The announcement of the verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sadness by the victims' families, who saw it as a measure of justice, but also a painful reminder of the tragedy that had brought them to this point. For the defense, the verdict represented a profound disappointment and a stark reminder of the challenges faced by those advocating for individuals with mental illness within the criminal justice system. The trial of Joseph Corcoran not only secured a conviction, but also sparked a broader conversation about the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility. It raised questions about whether the death penalty is an appropriate punishment for individuals whose actions are influenced by severe psychological disorders, and whether more could have been done to prevent such a tragedy. For those involved, the trial was not just a legal proceeding, but a moral reckoning, forcing them to grapple with the complexities of justice, accountability, and compassion. The legacy of Joseph Corcoran's case is one of pain, controversy, and unresolved questions about justice, mental health, and the efficacy of the death penalty. Years after the night that claimed the lives of 4 innocent people, the ramifications of Corcoran's actions and the subsequent legal proceedings continue to ripple through the community, the criminal justice system, and the lives of those left behind. It is a story that forces us to examine the deeper issues surrounding societal failures, the limitations of our mental health systems, and the moral dilemmas posed by capital punishment. For the families of the victims, the loss remains a profound wound that time has failed to heal. James Corcoran's surviving relatives struggled to reconcile their love for Joseph, a family member, with their grief and anger over his actions. Family gatherings that once symbolized unity and support became tinged with sorrow and absence. Kelly Corcoran's family, too, faced unimaginable heartbreak, mourning the loss of a woman described as warm, kind, and patient, a person who had tried to provide Joseph with a stable environment despite his volatile nature. Tim Green's friends and relatives were devastated by the loss of a man they remembered as outgoing and compassionate, while Thomas Corbett's death left a void in the extended family that no one could fill. The trial and its outcome provided a semblance of closure for some, but for others, the lingering questions overshadowed any sense of justice. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Were there moments in Joseph's life when intervention might have altered his trajectory? These questions haunted not only the families, but also the broader community of Fort Wayne, which had been shaken to its core by the horrific events of July 26, 1997. The case became a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked mental illness and family discord. For Joseph Corcoran himself, the years following his sentencing were spent on death row, a place where he was left to confront the enormity of his actions. Advocates for mental health reform and opponents of the death penalty took a particular interest in his case, using it as an example of the complex intersection between mental illness and criminal responsibility. They argued that executing a man diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia raised serious ethical concerns, pointing to Joseph's delusions and psychosis as evidence that he had not been fully in control of his actions. Legal battles surrounding Joseph's sentence stretched on for years as his defense team filed a series of appeals. These appeals argued that executing someone with a severe mental illness violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to evolving standards of decency in the United States, highlighting cases in which the courts had barred the execution of individuals with intellectual disabilities or those who were juveniles at the time of their crimes. Joseph's case, they argued, should be treated in a similar manner, given the role his untreated mental illness had played in the murders. The appeals process brought renewed attention to Joseph's case, sparking debates among legal scholars, mental health professionals, and the public. Supporters of the death penalty argued that the heinous nature of Joseph's crime warranted the ultimate punishment, regardless of his mental state. They emphasized the premeditation and ruthlessness with which he had carried out the murders, asserting that his mental illness did not absolve him of responsibility. Opponents, however, pointed to the systemic failures that had allowed Joseph's condition to go untreated for so long, arguing that society bore some responsibility for his descent into violence. These debates extended beyond Joseph's individual case, touching on broader issues of how the criminal justice system handles mentally ill offenders. Critics of the system highlighted the lack of resources and support for individuals suffering from severe psychological disorders, arguing that early intervention might have prevented Joseph's paranoia from escalating into violence. They called for reforms aimed at improving access to mental health care, particularly for vulnerable populations, and for greater emphasis on rehabilitation rather than punishment for offenders with documented mental illnesses. For the legal system, Joseph's case became a focal point in the ongoing debate over the death penalty itself. While capital punishment remains a contentious issue in the United States, cases like Joseph's underscore the complexities of its application. Advocates for its abolition argue that the death penalty is inherently flawed, prone to error, and disproportionately applied to individuals from marginalized backgrounds, including those with mental illnesses. They contend that cases like Joseph's illustrate the need for a more compassionate and nuanced approach to justice. Within the community of Fort Wayne, the case left a lasting impact on those who lived through its aftermath. Neighbors who had known the Corcoran family expressed a mixture of grief, regret, and disbelief, struggling to make sense of how a seemingly ordinary household could become the site of such an atrocity. Local schools, churches, and community organizations used the tragedy as an impetus to promote greater awareness of mental health issues, launching initiatives aimed at reducing stigma and encouraging individuals to seek help. Meanwhile, the memory of the victims was preserved through memorials, vigils, and acts of community solidarity. James and Kelly Corcoran, Tim Green, and Thomas Corbett were remembered not for the manner of their deaths, but for the lives they had lived, and the positive impact they had on those around them. Friends and family members organized events to honor their legacies, using their stories as a source of inspiration and a call to action for addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to their deaths. Joseph's case also served as a cautionary tale for families and professionals navigating the complexities of mental illness. It highlighted the importance of recognizing early warning signs, addressing behavioral changes, and seeking professional help before a crisis occurs. Mental health advocates pointed to the tragedy as evidence of the urgent need for systemic change, calling for greater investment in mental health care infrastructure and a shift in societal attitudes toward those living with mental illness. As the years passed, the story of Joseph Corcoran and the Quadruple Homicide faded from the headlines, but its impact endured. For some, it became a symbol of the justice system's ability to hold even the most troubled individuals accountable for their actions. For others, it was a reminder of the system's limitations and the need for greater compassion and understanding in addressing the root causes of crime. Ultimately, the legacy of Joseph Corcoran's case is a complex and multifaceted one, reflecting the tensions between justice and mercy, punishment and rehabilitation, and the individual and societal factors that shape human behavior. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of violence, the failures of our institutions, and the enduring pain left in the wake of tragedy. As we continue to grapple with these issues, the lessons of Joseph Corcoran's case remain as relevant as ever, challenging us to build a society that prioritizes prevention, intervention, and healing over retribution and despair.